Hi, and welcome to today's episode of Piano TV. I want to talk to you guys today about how to learn a song or a piece right from the beginning. And this is the kind of thing I sort of walk you through when we do tutorials. Like, I'll kind of break it apart the way like I might do if I was learning it myself. But it was brought to my attention that I haven't actually done like a dedicated video to how I would approach a piece for the very first time. So that's what we're going to do today. I'm going to be as detailed and specific as I think you'll find helpful. And yeah, let's get started. Here's how I break it down, and then we're going to go over the individual points here in more depth. And at the end of this video, I'm going to share some additional practice tips for when you're learning a piece for the first time that I think you might find helpful. So anyway, phase one represents everything I generally do before even attempting to play the piece, whereas phase two is active, and it's the actual playing part. So phase one is basically I listen through the piece first. I brush up on any historical details like what song form it's in, who the composer is, that kind of thing. And then thirdly, I physically mark up the piece into workable chunks and sections. So that's all like the pre-playing piano phase. And then phase two is just starting with small sections, even like 4-bar sections, and playing it slowly. And then once I can play it slowly, I stop. Just because I find that stopping and then letting your brain marinate is a really good way to learn a little bit quicker and easier with less struggle. And then the third step is just rinse and repeat for the rest of the piece. The first thing I do before learning a piece is I listen to it. So sometimes it's a piece I've heard before, and if that's the case, I'll just listen maybe once or twice as a refresher. But if it's a completely new piece and I've never heard it before, I'll definitely listen through several times, usually with sheet music in front of me. You want to use all your senses when you start a piece, and that includes your ear. I like to start with the ear while coupling that with reading. I find that especially good. So that would be like listening to the piece while following along with the sheet music. So once I kind of feel good about that, I then move to the analytical part of my brain, which would be like breaking it into sections. We'll talk about that. And then I move to the actual reading and playing, which is the tactile sensations. So say I'm learning a waltz. If I feel like I need to, I read up on what a waltz is, or maybe I'm learning an impromptu or a fantasy. Whatever it is, I like to familiarize myself with the genre before I even attempt to play it. So I'll ask myself questions like, what era was the genre popular? What are the tendencies of the genre? Any particular tempos, rhythms, and so on. In addition to getting an inside scoop on the genre, I like to have a working understanding of the composers as well. Learning music, I find, is a much richer experience when you can connect to a composer across space and time and get a sense that you actually know them. So I'll ask myself questions like, what's their nationality? When were they active? Even more importantly, what was their playing style like? Because you have some composers like Chopin that tended to be really delicate and quiet, whereas you had composers like Liszt who played with tons of energy. Once you've listened through a piece and you have a good understanding of the genre and form, I think it's a really good idea to go in and break it up into smaller components. Because when you're looking at like several pages of unbroken sheet music, your brain can get really overwhelmed. But if you start sectioning everything off, it suddenly looks and feels more manageable, even though it's the exact same music, obviously. So how you end up doing this is a personal choice, and it really depends on the type of music you're learning. So if you're doing, say, a sonata, I would just break it into the exposition, the development, the recapitulation. We did a video on that in the past. I'd break it into like its natural components, whereas I have a waltz in front of us here. So waltzes are generally in binary form or something similar to it. So you have to have some familiarity with how the song goes. Otherwise, it's kind of hard to tell where the sections change. Like at the end of the second page here, this is obviously a break into a new part. You can see the double bar line. So that would be an obvious section ender. But this one's a little bit more subtle to find, but there's a break right here. This is where we switch from like kind of the slow waltzy part to the fast, more intense moving part. So this would be a very clear section change, but still we're looking at one page of unbroken music and one other whole page of unbroken music. So I'd break that down further. If we look at the first page, you'll notice that from here to here to here, and then here to here is almost like a little bit of a repeat. There's some variation, but it's basically the same part, just a different version of it. And I would also even like further probably break down this little chromatic section, maybe starting from from here, just because this is quite different. It's almost like a little bit of a intermediate passage. It's kind of like a transition. And if you're looking over here on this page, you'll notice that things start to repeat here. Da 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 da. Da, 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 da. It's kind of the same part. So you want to look for those repeats anytime things drastically change and just start going and marking it up. So that takes care of phase one, everything that I like to do before I even get to the piano. So now we're going to take a look at all the three different steps in phase two. Start with one small section, usually a 4-bar fragment, and then slowly work through a part hands separate or one voice at a time. Often what I see is people attempt to sight read a whole page or two of music all at once when they're just starting. But that is usually just a way to burn out your brain really fast. Like, your brain has to process so much new input when you do that, that by the time you get to the end of the page, you've pretty much forgotten what you played at the beginning of the page. So this is why I always start with really small fragments, usually 4 bars, since music tends to be divided in 4s, but I mean, it isn't always. One good way to do this too is you could start by learning a phrase, because phrases tend to be good guides when it sounds natural to start and stop. I tend to go really slow. I maybe run through it hands separately once or twice, and then I put it hands together. If it's a piece with multiple voices like a fugue, I do like to go through each individual voice, of course using the correct fingering. I might even spend 10 or 15 minutes just on this 4-bar piece. It depends on how well I digest it. So the goal is to start building this part into your memory so that when you go and play it again, your brain is like, aha, I remember this. But after those 10 or 15 minutes, it's not going to be learned. You're not going to be perfect at it. It's still going to feel a little clumsy. But basically at the end of that 10 or 15 minutes, I should be able to play it accurately, even if it's at a slow tempo. Once I can play a section slowly, hands together, but somewhat comfortably, I stop working on it. And then my brain marinates on it overnight, because I never like to belabor a new part. I never like to beat it to death. After just a little bit of practice, I put it away once I feel relatively comfortable with it, because your brain does magical things overnight, and I like to use that to my advantage. I find that I end up learning pieces faster that way than if I were to spend an hour working on the same part. I don't think I would advance as fast as if I spent 15 minutes on that part, waited a day, another 15 minutes, and so on. Because generally I find when I reapproach the same parts the next day, the first try or two is going to feel a little clumsy, but then I'll get quite a bit better at it. Much better than if I were to hammer at the same part for an hour in a row. So then I just repeat the previous 2 steps for all the other sections. Be sure to go over previously learned sections daily, because they'll start to get more comfortable with daily repetition. So say I spend 30 minutes working on a brand new piece. I've never played it before. Maybe I get through 3 different microsections. I spend 10 minutes on like 4-bar phrases, and then after 30 minutes, I'm like feeling pretty good about it. And I put it away for the night, and then the next day, I might spend 10 minutes reviewing the sections that I learned previously, and they'll come together pretty fast. And then I'll spend the remaining 20 minutes learning a couple new sections. And then I keep doing this over and over until I've basically made it through the whole piece. So you may think that time compounds when you do this, and that once you've learned so much, like 2 pages, say, you're going to have to practice for a whole hour in order to get to any of the new parts, because the review part is going to take so long. But I do find that the review process tends to be pretty constant in the early stages. As you start getting better and faster at certain sections, you're going to need to spend less time on them, and thus the review process will be shorter. So in like a standard half-hour practice session, 10 to 15 minutes of reviewing previous parts is plenty, even when you start adding more and more sections. Because the idea isn't to master the piece at this point. The idea is to get through the whole thing so that you can play the whole thing, however many pages it is, slowly at a pretty comfortable tempo, like a slow, steady tempo. Once you can do that, that's when you go and start in the, doing more detail work, trying to speed it up and stuff. But we're not trying to do this in the early phases when we're just learning. All right, so tip time. My first tip is to make sure you're playing the rhythm accurately right from the beginning. What I notice people do is people are generally pretty good about being diligent reading the notes. So a lot of the times what I'll see is if someone's playing the wrong note, they'll fix it to the right note when they figure out they're doing it wrong. But I don't always see that same diligence and attention when it comes to rhythm. Sometimes, I don't know if it's not being able to listen to it objectively enough, thinking it's right when it's not. But rhythm is something that you really don't want to overlook, because anytime you practice something wrong, you're practicing it wrong. So you want to make sure that you're practicing it right as early as you can. So like even from the first few tries, you want to make sure you're figuring out that rhythm. I mean, in general, my number one tip for you, if you take nothing else away from this, is just to be accurate. Be as accurate as you can, whether it be the notes, the rhythm, the details, etc. Tip number 2. If you find yourself pausing, hesitating, having a little slip or a little problem in like some tiny small little section, isolate it, quarantine it, fix it immediately. Almost every time I learn a new piece, there's always like those little parts that are more difficult than the other parts, and they require more diligent practice than the other parts. You really want to like isolate them and get on top of the problem before it gets on top of you. I don't know. Tip number 3, pedal right from the get-go if your piece has pedal in it. You don't want to add pedal as an afterthought. You don't want to spend all this time learning your piece, getting pretty good at it, and then adding in the pedal, because it's never going to feel natural if you do that. But if you start with the pedal right from the beginning, you're kind of like training your ear to the sound of it. You're training your foot to just kind of move at a more natural cadence, and everything just seems to flow better. I know it seems like a lot sometimes when you're first learning a piece and there's like a million things to pay attention to, but it really, really is important. This is closely tied to the pedal tip that I just said, but for this one, I want to specifically say try to add details like accents, staccatos, dynamics right from the beginning too. Maybe not like your first try or your second try, but don't leave it too long. Again, the earlier you build in those details, you're training your ear to what they sound like. So say later, if you want to memorize the piece, you don't have to then go in and like specifically memorize all the different dynamics, because you already kind of have a feel for what you're supposed to be doing. Again, this ties into what I said earlier, that the most important thing you can really do is just strive for accuracy early on. And finally, another accuracy related tip: please do not play sloppy. So it's okay to make a few mistakes. We all do. It's a part of the process. But if you are making a lot of mistakes, if every time you play through a part there's a mistake, if you're just kind of like slopping through everything, then that means there's a problem. Either you're going too fast for yourself, you are doing something that's too difficult for your level. You should be able to, like, even on the first or second try, be able to be like almost entirely accurate. Maybe not like the first try, but like you really want your mistakes to be a very, very small part of your overall practice session. Because again, every time you hit a wrong note or do the wrong rhythm or something like that, you're practicing that. You want to practice the right notes, not the wrong notes. So sloppy playing, no dice. So that is all for today's video. Just remember, this is all going to be linked on the blog too if you want a breakdown of phase 1 and phase 2. But the one thing that people usually omit from this process is the whole phase 1 process, the whole like backstory part. And that's the part that I would suggest to you if you're not doing. I think it'll really enrich your music studies. So anyway, give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you haven't already. And thank you so much for watching. I will catch you in the next video. Whatever it is, I like to so then I just